The neighbors laughed at the widow when she stocked her house with firewood. She lived alone and did things differently from what people in the valley were used to. When a storm hit in winter, it became clear whose stoves would go out first. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The high valley lay open to the sky in a way that unsettled those who were not used to it. There were no dense forests to break the wind, no ridges close enough to offer shelter, only long sweeps of pale grass and stone that rolled outward until they met the distant line of mountains. In northern Wyoming, the land did not hide its intentions. It made no promise of mercy, no suggestion that effort alone would be rewarded. The wind moved across the valley almost constantly, sometimes as a low, steady pressure that never seemed to stop, sometimes as sudden force that arrived without warning, bending grass flat and rattling the walls of any structure foolish enough to stand unguarded. Even on calm days, the air carried motion in it, a reminder that stillness here was temporary and borrowed. The house stood where the valley rose just enough to drain spring, melt away from its foundation. It was not large, but it was solid, built with care and patience rather than speed. The logs had been set by hands that understood weight and balance, each one fitted to the next, with the quiet confidence of work done for permanence rather than display. It had been meant for two people, for shared labor and shared endurance, and the proportions of it still reflected that intention. Now it belonged to one woman alone, and the space around her felt both protective and exposed, as if the house itself were uncertain of its new purpose. She had not changed much since the days when her husband was alive, at least not in ways that were immediately visible. Her movements were still deliberate, her posture still upright from years of work that demanded balance and attention. But the house noticed the difference, even if no one else did. Doors were opened and closed more quietly. Lamps burned longer into the night. The sound of conversation, once rare but familiar, had vanished entirely. Silence had become the dominant presence inside the walls, settling into corners and lingering in rooms that had been designed for voices. The neighbors, such as they were, lived far enough away that weeks could pass without anyone appearing at her door. When they did come, it was usually for a practical reason, a question about water rights or a borrowed tool returned after long delay. Their manner toward her wasn't unkind, but it carried a distance that had not existed before. A woman alone in this place was regarded as an unresolved question. Some assumed she would leave when she could. Others believed she would endure until she could not, and that the valley would eventually decide the matter for her. No one said these things aloud, but they shaped the way people looked at her, the way they paused before offering advice that sounded suspiciously like instruction. Her husband had died 3 winters earlier, during a season that began gently and turned cruel without warning. He had been strong, accustomed to long days in cold weather, but strength had limits that pride often ignored. A delayed return from a routine task, a night spent exposed to wind that cut deeper than expected, and by the time help reached him, it was already too late. There had been no drama in his passing, no final words that could be carried forward as comfort. Just the simple, devastating fact that he had misjudged the conditions, and the land had corrected him. In the months that followed, she had moved through her days with the steady discipline of someone who understood that grief could not be allowed to interrupt survival. Animals needed care, fences needed repair, firewood needed splitting and stacking. The work did not pause to acknowledge loss, and she learned quickly that neither could she. Yet as the seasons turned, she began to recognize that something fundamental had shifted. What had once been shared judgment was now hers alone. Every decision carried its full weight directly to her, with no one to balance it or soften its consequences. The first winter after his death was the one that taught her how narrow the margin truly was. She had prepared as she always had, stacking firewood near the house, covering it as best she could, trusting methods that had worked often enough to feel reliable. But that winter brought a sequence of wet storms that drove moisture into places she had never considered vulnerable. Snow fell heavy and close to freezing, then refroze overnight, sealing the wood in a slick shell that resisted even her strongest efforts. She remembered the sound of it when she struck a log against the chopping block, not the clean ring of dry wood, but a dull thud that spoke of water trapped inside. There were nights when the fire struggled to take hold, when smoke filled the room before heat could, when she sat wrapped in layers of clothing and listened to the wind claw at the walls. She slept lightly, waking often to check the stove, fearing the moment when the embers would die before morning. It wasn't the cold itself that frightened her most, but the uncertainty. She had enough wood by every ordinary measure, yet it failed her when she needed it most. Quantity had proven meaningless without control. As the winter dragged on, she began to notice patterns she had ignored before. The way the wind shifted after storms, carrying moisture from certain directions. The way even a well-placed tarp became a funnel under sustained pressure. The way the house itself lost heat fastest on the sides, most exposed to moving air. These observations did not arrive as sudden insight, but accumulated slowly, day after day, like lines etched into stone by persistent water. By spring, when the valley finally loosened its grip, she understood that the danger she faced was not dramatic or sudden. It was structural. Summer gave her time to think, and thinking, she discovered, was as demanding as physical labor. She walked the perimeter of the house repeatedly, standing still to feel the wind on her face, noting where it struck hardest and where it eased. She paid attention to how rain behaved when it fell sideways instead of down, how it found gaps she had never sealed because she had never believed it necessary. The house, solid as it was, had been built with assumptions that no longer held true for someone living alone, without margin for error. The neighbors saw only that she spent long hours outside, studying the walls of her own home as if she expected them to speak. They shook their heads at the sight of her measuring distances with a length of rope, marking points in the ground with stones. To them, it looked like indecision, or worse, the kind of restless behavior that preceded abandoning a place altogether. They did not understand that she was doing the opposite. She was committing herself more deeply than before, not to comfort or tradition, but to reality as it was, rather than as people preferred to imagine it. By late summer, the idea had not yet taken a clear shape, but the necessity of change had become undeniable. She knew now that surviving here could not depend on favorable weather or inherited habits. It required a system that accounted for the valley's worst moods, not its average ones. Standing in the open, with the wind pressing steadily against her back, she accepted a truth that would guide everything that followed. If she was to remain, she would have to build not for how things usually were, but for how they could become when the land decided to test her resolve. The house, quiet and patient, waited. The understanding that had settled over her during the long summer did not arrive with relief. It came with weight. Once she admitted that the old ways were insufficient, there was no comfort in delay. The house had revealed its limits, and the valley had shown her how easily those limits could be crossed. She could not unknow what she now knew. Survival here could no longer rest on habit or memory. It required intention. She began by stripping the problem down to its simplest elements. Fire kept her alive in winter. Fire depended on dry fuel. Dry fuel depended not on how it was stacked, but on whether wind and moisture could reach it. She had trusted coverings and placement before, believing that if snow was kept off the top, The rest would take care of itself. Experience had proven otherwise. Wind did not behave politely, did not respect edges or intentions. It forced moisture sideways, upward, into seams that had never been designed to resist it. The solution, once she allowed herself to consider it fully, felt both obvious and excessive. If the wind was the enemy, then it had to be stopped before it reached anything that mattered. Not deflected in one place and invited in another, but broken, slowed, made to lose its force entirely. The house itself needed a second skin, something that would take the first blow and leave the interior in relative calm. Firewood, tools, supplies, all of it needed to live inside that buffer, not outside it. She dismissed the idea of a separate shed almost immediately. Anything placed apart from the house would require exposure during storms, when every step outside carried risk. She had learned that lesson during the nights when the wind howled so loudly it erased all other sound. If she had to choose between warmth and safety, the choice would never feel acceptable. Whatever she built had to be integrated, reachable without stepping into the open. The thought returned again and again to the space directly around the house. Not an addition in the usual sense, not a new room or wing, but a continuous covered passage, wide enough to move and work in, strong enough to stand against snow and wind. A gallery that wrapped the house completely, turning the exposed walls into an interior boundary instead of an exterior one. The idea felt audacious, even to her. She had never seen such a thing done here. That alone was enough to make others suspicious. Once the idea took root, she tested it the only way she knew how, by walking it through every condition she could imagine. She paced the perimeter, counting steps, measuring distances with her own body as reference. She pictured snow piling against an outer wall instead of the house itself. She imagined reaching for wood during a storm and finding it dry and ready instead of frozen and useless. The vision was not romantic. It was practical to the point of severity. She knew it would take time. More time than anyone around her would consider reasonable. Lumber would have to be hauled, posts set, joints fitted carefully enough to withstand years of pressure. It would be work she would do alone, because asking for help would invite questions she was not prepared to answer. She had no desire to defend the idea before it existed. Let the results speak later, she thought. For now, silence would serve her better. When she began digging the first post holes, the reaction from the few neighbors who passed by was predictable. They stopped, leaned on fence rails or wagon wheels, watched her work with expressions that mixed curiosity and doubt. Someone asked what she was building. She answered simply that she was putting up a roof. The simplicity of the reply seemed to irritate them more than a longer explanation would have. A roof over what? They wanted to know. Over everything, she said, and went back to digging. The posts went in first, set several feet out from the house walls, deep enough to hold against frost and wind. She packed the earth around them carefully, using stone where she could, tamping until her arms ached. Each post marked a commitment she could not easily undo. As the ring of them began to take shape, the structure became visible enough to invite commentary. Some laughed openly, calling it a waste of good lumber. Others shook their heads in quiet disapproval, convinced she was exhausting herself for no reason. She listened without responding. Their words carried no authority over the wind, and it was the wind she was building against. If the work tired her, it also clarified her thinking. Each decision had to justify itself through function alone. There was no room for decoration, no patience for shortcuts that would fail when tested. She chose a roof pitch shallow enough to conserve materials, but steep enough to shed snow before it could accumulate dangerously. She planned ventilation carefully, knowing that trapped moisture would ruin everything just as surely as exposure would. The ledger boards that tied the new structure to the old house demanded precision. Any gap would become an invitation for water and air. She measured twice, cut once, and sometimes cut again when the fit was not exact. The work forced her into close contact with the house itself, reading its lines, understanding its slight irregularities, the way time and weather had shaped it. In this intimacy, she felt, more than at any other point since her husband's death, that she was continuing a conversation he had started, extending his work rather than replacing it. As summer shifted toward autumn, the outline of the gallery became unmistakable. Rafters stretched outward from the house, forming a continuous canopy. The outer wall began to rise, plank by plank, tight enough to block driving weather, but broken deliberately near the eaves to allow damp air to escape. Inside the growing enclosure, the quality of sound changed. The wind was still present, but muted, its force reduced to a distant pressure rather than a direct assault. The neighbors' visits grew less frequent as it became clear that she would not abandon the project. Curiosity gave way to indifference, then to a quiet watchfulness. No one admitted interest, but they noticed that she worked steadily, without the frantic pace of someone racing a deadline. She was not building in fear of winter. She was building as if winter were simply a known condition, neither enemy nor judge, but a force to be accommodated. By the time the first cold nights arrived, the gallery was functional, though not finished in any sense that mattered to appearances. The lumber was rough, the lines plain, but inside, the ground stayed dry even after heavy rain. Tools hung where they could be reached without wading through mud. Firewood stacked along the inner wall felt different when she lifted it, lighter somehow, cleaner in sound and touch. She stood one evening at the threshold between house and gallery, listening to the wind move beyond the outer wall. For the first time in years, it did not seem to press directly against her. It was there, undeniable, but held at a distance. Winter was coming, as it always did. The difference now was that she was no longer waiting to see what it would bring. She had already decided how she would meet it. Winter did not announce itself with drama. After the first hard nights of frost, the valley settled into a pattern that felt almost reassuring in its familiarity. Snow fell lightly, often melting by midday. The wind remained present, as it always did, but lacked the sharpness that signaled real danger. Neighbors went about their routines with renewed confidence, taking the early cold as proof that the season would behave as it usually had. Preparations that had sufficed for years felt adequate once again. She did not share that sense of ease. The calm felt provisional, as if the land were pausing rather than relenting. Each morning she walked the gallery, checking joints, listening for changes in sound, feeling for drafts with the back of her hand. The structure held. The outer wall bore the wind's pressure, and inside the air remained still enough that she could move without bracing herself. Firewood stacked along the inner perimeter stayed dry to the touch, its scent sharp and clean. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. When the weather turned, it did so without gradual warning. One afternoon the wind shifted, not in strength at first, but in character. It came low and persistent, carrying moisture that clung to everything it touched. By nightfall, snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that struck the outer wall sideways, driven by gusts that grew stronger with each passing hour. The temperature dropped steadily, not plunging all at once, but falling with relentless certainty. By morning, the valley was transformed. Visibility shrank to a narrow tunnel of moving white. The wind roared across the open ground, unbroken by trees or ridges, piling snow against fences and buildings in uneven drifts. What had been pathways the day before disappeared entirely. The storm did not rage in bursts. It sustained itself, hour after hour, pressing its advantage as if testing for weakness. She remained inside, tending the stove, listening. The sound of the wind was different now. Instead of striking the house directly, it battered the gallery's outer wall, a dull, constant pressure rather than a piercing assault. Snow built up against that wall, rising steadily, but the interior space stayed clear. She stepped into the gallery when she needed wood, closing the inner door behind her, and felt the difference immediately. The air was cold but calm, free of the force that made movement outside a struggle. Elsewhere in the valley, the storm exposed the limits of preparation. At the nearest homestead, a man fought with a tarp that had frozen stiff under layers of ice and snow. The knots that had held it secure for years refused to budge, and when he finally managed to tear a corner free, wind-driven snow poured into the woodpile beneath. The logs that had seemed dry only days before were now slick with ice, their surfaces glazed and unresponsive to flame. Another family watched helplessly as the lean-to shelter over their fuel collapsed under the combined weight of snow and wind pressure. Boards snapped, supports shifted, and what remained of the structure funneled moisture inward rather than shedding it. By the second night of the storm, their stove burned poorly, producing more smoke than heat. They fed it everything they could find that might catch, breaking furniture, tearing apart crates meant for spring repairs, each act a small surrender to necessity. The contrast between those struggles and her own experience was stark, though she did not frame it in terms of comparison. She focused instead on what worked. The firewood she brought in burned cleanly, lighting on the first match, producing steady heat without hiss or steam. The stove's draft remained consistent, untroubled by the shifting wind outside. The house retained warmth, not because the fire burned hotter, but because less heat was being stolen away. On the second night, a knock came at her door. It was hesitant at first, almost apologetic, then more insistent as the wind howled louder. When she opened it, she found a neighbor standing hunched against the cold, his coat rimed with ice, his face drawn with exhaustion. He did not explain himself at length. He did not need to. She stepped aside and let him in. Word traveled even when roads disappeared. Before dawn, another figure appeared, then another. By the third night of the storm, several people occupied the house, sleeping where they could, wrapped in whatever blankets she could spare. The space grew crowded, but it remained functional. She continued to tend the fire, moving through the gallery for fuel without difficulty, selecting dry splits with the practiced ease that came from order. There was no sense of triumph in this, no satisfaction in being proved right. What she felt instead was a sober recognition that systems either held or failed under pressure, and that the valley was indifferent to which outcome befell its inhabitants. The gallery did not care who believed in it. It did what it had been built to do. The storm persisted for days. Snow packed against the outer wall until it reached nearly to the eaves, creating a solid barrier that further muted the wind. Inside, the temperature remained stable enough that people could sleep without waking to shiver. When the fire needed feeding in the dark hours before morning, she moved quietly, retrieving wood without fumbling or delay. As the storm finally began to lose strength, its fury spent, the valley emerged into a muted stillness. The wind eased, leaving behind drifts that reshaped the landscape into unfamiliar forms. People stepped cautiously from their homes to assess what remained. In many places, fuel supplies lay ruined or inaccessible, frozen into useless masses that would require days of work to salvage, if they could be salvaged at all. Her house stood unchanged, The gallery bore the marks of the storm in scuffed planks and packed snow, but its interior remained dry and orderly. The wood she had stored was diminished only by what she had used and shared, not by loss. The structure had been tested in precisely the way she had imagined during the long months of planning, and it had responded without surprise. When those who had sought shelter began to return to their own homes, there was little said beyond quiet thanks. Exhaustion left no room for analysis, but the silence carried weight. The storm had stripped away assumptions as effectively as it had stripped warmth from unprotected houses. What remained was a clear understanding of what had failed and what had endured. She watched them go, then closed the door and returned to the steady rhythm of her days. Winter was not over. There would be more storms, more nights of cold. But the hardest test had come and gone, and the house had answered it without faltering. The decision she had made months earlier, against advice and custom, had carried her through the worst the valley could offer. As she banked the fire that evening, she felt no sense of finality, only continuity. The system she had built was not a response to one storm, but a way of living that acknowledged reality without resentment. Outside, the land waited, as it always did, indifferent and enduring. Inside, she waited as well, no longer in uncertainty, but in readiness. Winter did not leave the valley in a single gesture. It withdrew slowly, as if reluctant to surrender ground it had claimed so thoroughly. The snow remained long after the storms ended, compacted into hard layers that resisted the first weak warmth of the sun. Days grew brighter, but not immediately warmer. Night still carried frost, and the wind, though softened, had not forgotten its old paths across the open land. She noticed the change, not by the calendar, but by sound. Water began to move again beneath the ice, a distant, muffled current that hinted at release. The air lost some of its edge. The gallery, which had served as a barrier through the worst months, now felt almost spacious, its purpose shifting subtly from defense to order. She moved through it with the same habits she had formed in winter, checking stores, stacking what remained of the firewood more tightly, already thinking ahead to the next cycle. When people emerged from their homes more regularly, the valley felt altered in ways that had nothing to do with snow or temperature. Conversations resumed, but they didn't sound the same. There was less certainty in them, less reliance on phrases that began with how things had always been done. Loss had a way of doing that, stripping away confidence that had never been tested properly before. The first neighbor to stop by did so under the pretense of returning a borrowed tool. He lingered longer than necessary, his eyes tracing the lines of the gallery, measuring without appearing to do so. He spoke cautiously, as if each question carried the risk of exposing something he had not yet named to himself. How far out the posts were set, how she had managed drainage when the snow piled so high. She answered plainly, without embellishment, without the tone of someone offering instruction. When he left, he thanked her again, more deliberately this time, and she understood that the words carried more than simple courtesy. Others followed in the weeks that came after. Some arrived openly, admitting that the winter had forced them to reconsider their assumptions. Others pretended to be merely curious, asking questions as if for general interest rather than personal necessity. She treated them all the same. She did not lecture. She did not recount the storm as proof of anything. She showed them what they asked to see, explained what they wanted to understand, and let the rest remain unspoken. Not everyone chose to change. A few held to the belief that the storm had been an anomaly, an outlier that did not justify altering long-standing habits. She did not argue with them. The valley would answer that question in its own time, and she had no need to convince anyone of what she already knew. What mattered to her was that she no longer depended on consensus for survival. Some changes were visible almost immediately. By late spring, new posts appeared on neighboring properties, set at cautious distances from house walls. Partial galleries took shape, some covering only the most exposed sides of buildings, others enclosing small sections of space meant for firewood alone. None matched her structure exactly. Each reflected the limits and priorities of the people who built them. But the underlying principle had taken root, quiet and persistent. The fire warden, who had visited once during the winter in the aftermath of the storm, returned when the ground finally softened enough to walk easily. He examined the gallery with professional interest, noting the separation between stored materials, the clear paths, the absence of clutter near the stovepipe exits. He said little, but when he left, he mentioned that he would be recommending similar arrangements where possible. Not as a requirement, he clarified, but as an example of how preparation could reduce risk rather than increase it. She listened and nodded, knowing that such endorsements carried weight she had never sought. As the days lengthened, she began the work of transition. Winter supplies were consolidated, damaged items repaired or discarded. The gallery became a place of sorting rather than shelter. She swept it clean of debris carried in by boots and wind, restoring order not because it was necessary for survival at the moment, but because it was how she lived now. The system did not turn off when danger passed. It simply adapted. There were moments in the quieter evenings of early summer when the absence of winter's urgency left space for reflection. She thought of her husband then, not with the sharpness of grief that had followed his death, but with a steadier recognition of what they had built together and what she had extended alone. The house no longer felt like a remnant of a shared life cut short. It felt complete again, though altered, shaped by experience rather than hope. She understood now that solitude did not have to mean vulnerability. The winter had proven that isolation could be endured, even managed, if one respected the conditions that made it dangerous. The gallery had not erased her aloneness, but it had removed the constant threat that came with it. She could face the seasons without measuring every decision against fear. By the time the valley turned fully green, the memory of the storm had settled into something quieter, less immediate. People spoke of it occasionally, usually when reinforcing a structure or stacking wood more carefully than before. It became a reference point rather than a wound. She listened to these conversations without comment, content to let the lessons remain where they belonged, in practice rather than story. On a warm afternoon, she stood at the edge of her land and looked back at the house. The gallery encircled it plainly, without ornament or apology. It did not make the house beautiful in any conventional sense. It made it capable. That, she had learned, was enough. She turned back to her work, already thinking ahead to the next winter, not with dread or anticipation, but with acceptance. The valley would do what it always did. The wind would return. Snow would fall. The difference now was simple and profound. When it happened, she would be ready, not because she believed she could control the land, but because she had learned how to live within its limits. The house remained, and this time it was not waiting to see what winter would decide. If you value stories about real preparation, quiet resilience, and people who chose to think ahead when others did not, make sure to subscribe to the channel. More true-to-life accounts like this are coming. Watch the next videos to discover other stories where simple decisions made all the difference. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who would appreciate it too.